What do you believe the federal government's role is regarding the Second Amendment?
Well, my perspective is the federal government has to be focused on what's in the Constitution. And the Second Amendment is one of our fundamental rights, the right to bear arms. So when it comes to states trying to usurp that right, I think the federal government has the obligation to step in and make sure that right is not trampled on. Same thing should happen with free speech. The same thing should happen with our Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. I don't think that's a gray area.
Thank you.
What are your thoughts on the Patriot Act?
Well, you have to look at the time that we were going through. I think there are times of war call for specific measures. The caveat is times of war. This shouldn't be something that is a carte blanche to expand powers and basically override the rights and the privacy of American citizens. Now, someone's coming and visiting, or they're a temporary worker, or they overstayed a visa. I think they don't have the same rights that we do because they're not United States citizens. And I think at some level we need to trust the government to do what's in our best interests. However, unfettered access without any oversight for any prolonged period of time is not a good thing.
Do you believe a state has the right to nullify a federal law? Explain your stance on the 10th Amendment, using health care as an example. In other words, if the federal government passes the health care bill as it currently exists, do you believe that it has usurped the rights that belong to the states? If so, what recourse is available to members of Congress and or its state government?
Well, my position on the 10th Amendment is I think the Commerce Clause was misinterpreted, and the government's gotten into a lot more things that it needs than it's in. I think if there's a law that's passed by the federal government that's unconstitutional, which I believe healthcare is, that it's the obligation of the states to fight that law. There are rights and powers granted to the federal government that are not specifically reserved for the states. And what we have allowed to happen over the last 90 years is the states just aren't saying anything. And what the government is doing is basically buying us off with pork. Special interest projects, highway funds, whatever you want to call it, they keep buying off our politicians saying, don't worry about it, it's in your best interest that we do this. I think what people are realizing now is that Washington is an ever-expanding black hole. And for every dollar we send, you're lucky if you get 5 cents back. So I think I'll give you, for instance, beyond healthcare. Let's take it to the extreme. Let's say the federal government decides to say that slavery is legal again. I challenge any state to not defy that law. Now, what congressmen can do is introduce legislation to overturn it or fight the laws that are being put forward. I heard a comment by our esteemed Congressman Jim Himes at one of his town hall meetings last week. And someone mentioned healthcare specifically, saying that we don't think it's constitutional. And his response was, well, I'm not a constitutional lawyer. And that's why we have the Supreme Court. But I think the Constitution was written by farmers, merchants, doctors. There may have been a couple of lawyers. It's not a complicated document. I've read it several times. On its face, you can pretty much tell if what you're doing contravenes anything that's in that document. And if you have to ask, you're probably stepping outside the lines. So the fact that these guys are pushing legislation that they know is going to get challenged on the hope that an activist judge is now going to legislate from the bench and say, you know what, we think this is okay, that completely undermines the separation of powers that was written into our country.
What was your reaction to the Kelo eminent domain case?
I'm not 100% familiar with that case. My understanding was it was basically a seizure of private land for private use.
For business use.
For business use. I would fight that every day, 24/7. I understand the law of eminent domain when there is a critical need for the population. I cannot ever envision a commercial use falling under that category. I mean, take Super 7, for instance. Back in the 60s, the government basically confiscated all these people's homes and gave them a pittance for them. And then it's been battered around and fought for the last 30 years, no Super 7. What happens to all those people that gave up their rights to their land? I don't think that's right.
Going forward, what do you believe our policy should be on the war on terror?
First of all, acknowledge it's a war and that we need to fight to win. I've got a brother who's been stationed in Afghanistan for most of last year, and what we need to realize is we are fighting a global enterprise that has one goal, and that's to kill us, take over everything. If we don't fight to win, we don't deserve to be in the fight. And there's a couple things that I think we need to be cognizant of. I read Stanley McChrystal's report, and he asked for 40,000 troops, which I think was reasonable. Why he got 30,000, I don't know. But in his report, he also mentioned this is not just a military solution. The situation we're dealing with, particularly in Afghanistan, is you've got a tribal culture that does not have a solid economic base. These people have a hard time feeding themselves, clothing themselves. And the Taliban, we basically put them in power. They're coming in, and they're going to a village, and they're going to a man, and he has 2 or 3 children, and they have nothing. And the Taliban are saying, we will take your son, we'll feed him, we'll clothe him, we'll teach him in the ways of Allah, and teach him to read the Quran. He'll be an educated man, and you won't have to worry about him. Now, the villager's thinking to himself, okay, the Americans are here, but they're going to be leaving soon. I can't feed him. You know what? This isn't a bad option. Take my son. In 5 years, you've got another suicide bomber, another jihadist who is coming after us. What we need to do is try to stabilize the environment, and it's going to take more than 40,000 troops. This is not an easy situation, but we need to give them the ability to build their own government in a stable situation. Help them with schools, help them with infrastructure, help them with establishing some commerce that's not poppies that they can use to feed themselves on a go-forward basis. When they start to realize the fruits of the independence, women being educated, women allowed to vote, standard living, plumbing, things that we take for granted every day, I think the allure of the Taliban and the ability for Al-Qaeda to operate are going to be lessened significantly.
With the tribal culture that is there, do you think there is the will and the desire to have a real national government? Is it possible?
That I don't know. I mean, look at what happened in Iraq. We ended up with a coalition of 3 different factions. It may be something that is what we have to put forth. And when they realize that that's how they're going to be governed, maybe it'll work. We can't assume that everyone wants to be a democracy. I mean, I personally believe democracy is the best form of government, but we've seen how it can be sidetracked and usurped for other means. You have to work with what you have, and we're looking at thousands of years of history.